I had just stepped off the bus after a 14-hour ride from Boston to Seattle. My legs were still numb, but my heart was pounding with anticipation. I stood in front of the delivery room at Riverside Medical Center, ready to meet my first grandchild. But before I could enter, my son, Evan, leaned down and quietly told the nurse, "Please, don't let my mom in. She doesn't want to see her." I froze. Julia, Evan's wife, turned her face away the moment she saw my shadow through the door crack, as if I shouldn't be there at all. I stood alone in the cold hallway, hearing a newborn's cry echo from the delivery room as my heart tightened. I thought today would be the day I held my grandchild, but the way Evan avoided looking at me said something else. Maybe I had been cut out of this family long ago, and I just didn't know it. My name is Linda, and I am 62 years old, living in a small house in Boston. I don't have much to boast about in life except that I raised my son, Evan, to adulthood with 2 jobs and every ounce of strength I had. I'm no longer young, but I'm not fragile. And this is the story that, until now, I finally dare to tell. If you've ever been hurt by the people closest to you, I hope this story gives you a sense of being understood. Follow the channel as we go through each part, because the truth is, many of us aren't as alone as we think we are. I sat down on the hard plastic chair in the hallway of Riverside Medical Center. February in Seattle was freezing, and the cold seemed to seep right into the hospital. From behind the delivery room door, the newborn cried for the first time. That sound should have made me burst into tears from joy. Instead, it made my chest tighten. Evan stood just a few steps away from me, but that distance felt impossibly far. My son kept avoiding my eyes. Whenever I tried to ask him something, he only replied briefly, "Mom, later. Julia's tired." Julia lay on the hospital bed inside, but when I looked through the glass window, she turned her face away, avoiding me. The way she held the baby, the tension in her body, made one thing painfully clear. I wasn't considered someone who should be here. Nurses passed by and asked if I needed water, but I simply shook my head. My throat was too tight to swallow anything. I had traveled across half the country just to see my grandchild, but now the only feeling I had was that I didn't belong here. As night fell, Evan said only one sentence. "Mom, it's not a good time today. Go back to the hotel and rest." And so I left the hospital. The cold wind slapped against my face and my hands shook so much I struggled to unlock the door to the room I'd rented. I always knew motherhood wasn't easy, but I never imagined there would come a day when I'd be pushed out at the very moment my grandchild was born. The feeling was like losing something precious, something I didn't know when or if I'd ever get back. When Evan was 14, our lives changed completely. My husband, Mark, died in a highway accident. That night, when the police knocked on my door and delivered the news, I knew my son had only me left. The first months were incredibly hard. Evan became quiet, and I tried to be strong enough to fill the enormous void. To provide for him, I took 2 jobs. In the mornings, I worked as a janitor at a small dental office. In the evenings, I worked part-time at an animal clinic. Every day, I came home with hands exhausted from bleach and disinfectant, but I still forced myself to smile when I walked through the door. Our evenings were simple back then, mostly instant noodles, fried eggs, or reheated soup. But Evan always waited for me to come home so we could eat together. He'd share stories about school, friends, or the science projects he loved. Those poor but laughter-filled dinners helped us survive the grief. I know I held on to my son too tightly. After losing Mark, I feared losing Evan in any way. I checked his schedules, asked where he went, with whom, how he was doing, and whether he felt sad. Back then, I had only one thought. I cannot let Evan lack anything. But now, looking back, maybe that very protectiveness made Evan grow up feeling he had to reassure me about everything. And when he married Julia, someone who wanted freedom, clarity, and no emotional constraints, I understood why she sometimes felt suffocated. Still, back then, it was just Evan and me. We were everything to each other. Evan got into the University of Oregon at 18. The day I sent him off on the bus, I tried to smile calmly, but inside I felt hollow. I knew he needed a bigger life, more opportunities, but I couldn't stop feeling as if I were letting go of something irreplaceable. During the first months, Evan called every night. Even just a few minutes made me feel warm. However, classes became heavier, and he made new friends and took on new projects. The calls became less frequent. Every night, every 3 or 4 days, then just once a week. One evening, Evan said, "Mom, I'm seeing someone. Her name is Julia Harper." I could hear the happiness in his voice. Julia was a young architect, 2 years his senior, from a well-educated and well-off family in Seattle. Evan said she was intelligent, independent, and had everything planned for the future. I congratulated him, but after that, I realized Evan began sharing fewer things with me. Whenever I asked, "How are you eating? Is school tough?" Evan would only reply, "I'm fine, Mom, don't worry." Once I asked, "Why don't you call as often anymore?" Evan went silent for a moment, then said, "Julia said, I should focus on school and work. She doesn't want me distracted." After that, whenever we talked, Evan seemed more careful, more guarded, as if saying the wrong thing would upset Julia. Nobody said it aloud, but I began feeling it clearly. I was being pushed out of my son's life. Little by little, quietly, but undeniably. I received Evan's wedding announcement only about 2 months before the wedding day. There was no call to discuss, no asking for my opinion, no request for help preparing anything. Julia and her family had arranged everything, and I was simply notified to attend. The wedding took place in a small garden in Seattle. Everything was beautiful and perfectly arranged, the kind of setting wealthier families chose: white flowers, light-colored wooden chairs, soft music filling the space. But when I looked for my seat, my heart sank. My seat was placed in the 3rd row, behind Julia's extended family. I tried to tell myself, it's fine, as long as he's happy. Julia walked up to me and offered a polite, distant line. "Thank you for coming, Linda." Her smile was polite but distant, as if I were just a familiar guest, not the groom's mother. Meanwhile, Julia's mother was constantly on the move, directing the photographer, reminding the servers, and deciding every small detail. She glanced at me a few times, not unkindly, but clearly enough to show me. Their family was the center of this wedding. Evan was busy. He gave me one quick hug, then moved from one reception table to another. "Mom, I'm glad you're here. I'll come back in a bit." But in a bit never came. When the couple exchanged vows, everyone smiled. I smiled too. But deep inside my chest was a feeling I didn't want to admit. The distance between my son and me was growing, and I didn't know what to do except quietly accept it. By the end of the day, I told myself, as long as he's happy, that's enough. But inside, I knew that was the day I truly understood my place in Evan's new life. After the wedding, things didn't get better. Even the calls that used to warm my heart became short and rushed. Every time I called, Evan answered with the exact phrases, "I'm busy." "Julia's tired, Mom." "It's nothing, don't worry." I understood everyone eventually has their own family, but there was something in Evan's voice that felt strange. He no longer sounded comfortable talking to me. After about 3 minutes, he was ready to end the call. One evening, when I asked if he had eaten, Evan suddenly replied with something overlapping. "Mom, I'm an adult. Don't ask about tiny things like that." I fell silent immediately, not because I was angry, but because I was afraid. I was afraid every question I asked would irritate him, afraid outsiders would think I was the kind of mother who didn't know how to let go. I started practicing speaking less, not asking about his schedule, not asking about work, not asking whether he and Julia were doing well. I kept thinking that if I talked less, things would feel easier for him. But because of that silence, the distance between us only widened. Some nights, I sat in the kitchen staring at the quiet phone and tried to reassure myself, he's just busy today, he'll call tomorrow. But tomorrow was the same as yesterday, and the relationship that once meant the world to me was slipping into silence without me noticing. One evening, Evan called me after a long period of no contact. His voice sounded different, lighter, with a hint of excitement. "Mom, Julia's pregnant." I stood up straight in the middle of the kitchen. "That's wonderful, Evan. I'm so happy for you two. Truly happy." My whole body felt bright. Months of feeling pushed aside suddenly dissolved with just a single sentence. I was going to be a grandmother. That same night, I sent Julia a simple congratulatory message. "Congratulations, Julia. I'm very happy for you. If you need anything, just let me know." The message was seen, but left unanswered. I told myself, Julia must be tired. Pregnant women often are. I began knitting a small, pale yellow blanket and preparing a few cute gifts for the baby. Doing that made me feel closer to the grandchild I hadn't met yet. One day, Evan called again, speaking softly but firmly. "Mom, don't send too many things. Julia gets overwhelmed easily. I know you love the baby, but just let us handle things ourselves." I gripped the phone tighter but replied, "All right, I understand. I don't want to bother you." At that moment, the feeling of distance returned, clearer than before, but my heart still held onto a small hope. Once the baby is born, things will change. I clung to that hope, even though a quiet fear had already begun forming inside me, that I still had no place in the family my son was building. That day, I was cleaning up at the vet clinic during my evening shift. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I thought it was just a regular notification, but when I opened it, I froze in place. It was a Facebook post from Julia. A photo appeared clearly on the screen. Julia's mother is holding baby Leo, wrapped in a white blanket, eyes closed, cheeks pink. Below it was the caption, "Welcome to the world, Leo Harper Collins. Mom and baby are both healthy." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I had waited for this call for 9 months, but in the end, I found out at the same time as everyone else online. No one told me, not a message, not a call. I collapsed onto the break room chair, covering my face with both hands. I cried without making a sound, as if my throat had been locked shut. Only tears kept falling onto my uniform, still smelling of disinfectant. When I finally caught my breath, I called Evan. He answered after a few rings. "Evan, why didn't you call me?" His voice was soft and tired. "Mom, now isn't a good time. Julia needs rest. Everything is a mess right now. But I just wanna..." "Mom, I told you, not right now." Then Evan hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the cold white wall of the break room, trying to accept something I should have realized much earlier. In the most sacred moment of their family, I wasn't considered family. After nearly 3 weeks of waiting without any updates, Evan finally texted me, "Mom, you can visit on Saturday morning, but only in the morning. Julia needs rest." I immediately booked a bus ticket. During the 14-hour interstate ride, all I could think about was the moment I'd finally get to hold Leo. I kept telling myself, just one time holding my grandchild, that's enough. When I arrived at their apartment, Julia opened the door. She was still polite, but her expression couldn't hide the tension. Leo was in her arms, and Evan stood beside her, a mix of happiness and discomfort on his face. "Could I hold the baby for a bit?" I asked. Julia gently shook her head. "Leo just fell asleep. Moving him will make him fussy." I nodded, not wanting to cause trouble. For more than an hour, Julia held the baby almost the entire time, while I sat nearby looking at him through a thin blanket. I tried to keep things light by asking a few simple questions about her health, but Julia answered briefly without opening up. Evan looked at me several times, but his eyes seemed to plead, "Please don't make this harder." In that moment, I understood. They had already prepared themselves to keep their distance from me. As noon approached, Evan said, "Mom, let me call a taxi so you can make it back to the bus station on time." In the taxi, Julia suddenly placed Leo in my arms. "You can hold him for a bit." But gently, he startles easily. I held Leo and my heart tightened. He was tiny, warm, smelling faintly of milk. His little hand moved once, then curled around my finger. I held my grandchild for precisely 5 minutes. The driver announced we'd arrived, and Julia gently took Leo back. "We're here, Mom," Evan said as he opened the car door for me. I stepped out, gripping my bag strap to keep myself steady. Evan hugged me quickly and said, "Mom, thanks for understanding us. We know you don't want to put pressure on anyone." The words were soft, but they added another layer of pain to my heart. So, my silence was seen as the consideration they wanted from me. The taxi drove away. I stood in front of the bus station, watching it disappear completely. The ride back to Boston felt so heavy I didn't even dare look out the window, afraid I'd see how sad I looked. Deep down, I finally acknowledged the truth I'd been avoiding. In Seattle, I no longer had a place to stay. One morning, I got a call from an unfamiliar Seattle number. When I heard the woman introduce herself, I froze. "We're calling from Riverside Medical Center. On Julia Harper Collins' delivery records, you're listed as the secondary payer. There's an outstanding charge of $7,800 for the private room and supplemental medication. We need to confirm the payment date." I tightened my grip on the phone. No one told me when Julia went into labor. I wasn't there for my son. I didn't get to meet my grandchild properly. But when it came to money, they remembered me. I took a deep breath and spoke clearly. "I don't have any family in Seattle. You've called the wrong person." The woman hesitated, "But the information was provided by your son." "I'm sorry," I cut her off. I'm not involved with this bill." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but my mind felt unmistakably clear. For the first time in years, I did something to protect myself, not for anyone else. That evening, when I turned on my phone, there were nearly a dozen missed calls from Evan and a flood of messages. "Mom, why did you do that? I'm out of money. Why won't you help?" Julia cried all afternoon. "You made everything worse." "Mom, I don't understand you anymore." I read them all. It hurt, but I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to make a point, but because if I stayed silent about the way they treated me, I would lose the last piece of self-respect I had left. It wasn't revenge. It was a turning point. The first time I let go of something that was hurting me, even if that something was my own son. After the incident with the hospital bill, Evan stopped contacting me, and I didn't initiate anything either. Day after day passed, and my small house became so quiet that sometimes I could hear the ticking of the clock. But strangely, that silence no longer suffocated me the way it used to. Marisol, my longtime friend, was the one who pulled me out of those evenings spent staring into nothing. "Linda, you have to live," she said. So I signed up for a Wednesday evening cooking class. They only taught simple dishes, but it made me feel joyful again. In the mornings, I joined a walking group at the park near my house. No one knew my story. We just greeted each other, chatted a bit about the weather or a new batch of baked goods. Small things like that made my heart feel lighter. On weekends, Marisol and I read together at a cafe. We didn't talk about Evan or Julia or baby Leo. I knew she avoided the topic on purpose so I wouldn't feel hurt, and I appreciated that more than she knew. One day, while cleaning my closet, I paused in front of the photo of baby Leo that I had printed from that old Facebook post. My heart ached, but I also knew I was hurting myself by holding on. I placed the photo in a wooden box and put it on the top shelf, not because I wanted to forget him, just because I needed to stop wounding myself. I also stopped checking Evan and Julia's Facebook pages, stopped waiting for message notifications, stopped inventing excuses to call Evan just to check in a little. As time passed, I began to feel lighter. I slept more deeply. I laughed more. I realized I could live a life of my own, a life that didn't revolve around one person. No matter how important they were to me. I wasn't angry at Evan, I just let go. And because of that, I began to find myself again. Nearly a year after I put Leo's photo away, my life had settled again. I thought I would never return to Seattle. But then, one afternoon, my phone rang. The caller was a social worker. "Is this Mrs. Linda Morris? We're reaching out regarding the situation of Evan Morris's family." I froze. "Julia Harper has been hospitalized due to prolonged postpartum depression and family stress," she continued. "Evan is currently unemployed and emotionally unstable. Neither of them has support to care for the child. Baby Leo needs a temporary family member for safety." I didn't ask anything. No blame, no bringing up the past. I just said one sentence: "I'll be in Seattle tomorrow." When I arrived, Evan opened the door. He looked much thinner, his eyes red and exhausted. When he saw me, he didn't say a word. He just rushed forward and hugged me tightly the way he did when he was little. "Mom, I'm sorry." His voice broke. I placed my hand on his back gently. "It's all right. You need me now and I'm here." In the living room, Leo sat in a small crib. When I approached, he stared at me for a moment, then smiled and reached out both arms. I picked him up, and my heart softened instantly. That feeling had never left me. Over the next few days, I took care of Leo so Evan could focus on finding work again. I cooked, cleaned, watched the baby at night, and bathed him in warm water. Evan thanked me repeatedly, his voice cracking every time. Julia received treatment at the hospital. When her health stabilized, she asked to see me. She entered the room, sat across from me, her hands clasped together. "Linda, I'm sorry. I let my own insecurities make everything worse. I know I treated you unfairly." I looked at her, without anger or resentment. I don't want to revisit the past. What matters is how we treat each other from now on. Julia nodded, her eyes red but relieved. We slowly rebuilt our family rhythm. Evan became more open and transparent. Julia allowed herself to soften and listen. I set healthy boundaries, helping without overstepping, not taking over, and not interfering with their decisions. Respect, healthy distance, and a love big enough not to carry bitterness. That became our new foundation. One afternoon, while I was folding Leo's clothes, he toddled toward me, stumbled into my legs, and wrapped his arms around them. "Grandma Linda!" I bent down and lifted him up. My throat tightened, but this time, not from sadness. I understood that I could never regain the past, but I could build a better present, one rooted in compassion, not revenge. A family only lasts when there is respect, and sometimes kindness is the thing that heals all of us the most.